It was a Friday afternoon when the lockdown drill was announced. At first, no one in Mr. Garrett's classroom was concerned. Lockdown drills were routine at Garrison High, and most students just used them as an excuse to goof off. Today was different, though, because Mr. Garrett wasn't there. Instead, they had a substitute teacher, Mrs. Hendricks, a stern, older woman who no one seemed to know much about. The intercom buzzed. "This is a lockdown. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill." The energy in the room shifted immediately. Whispers rippled through the class as Mrs. Hendricks calmly closed the blinds and locked the door, signaling for everyone to move away from the windows and hide under their desks. "Stay quiet, no phones," she instructed, her voice sharp but composed. Most of the students complied, their faces pale with worry. Mrs. Hendricks stood by the door, watching them carefully, her eyes scanning the room like she was studying something. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from the hallway, followed by muffled footsteps. The tension in the room skyrocketed. Everyone held their breath, straining to hear what was happening outside. The footsteps drew closer, heavy and deliberate, stopping just outside the classroom door. The handle jiggled slightly. Then silence. The class collectively exhaled, but the relief was short-lived. Mrs. Hendricks moved to the center of the room, her face unsettlingly calm. "You all must remain absolutely quiet," she whispered, her voice low and conspiratorial. "What's happening out there is far worse than you think." A student, Jake, raised his hand. "Worse? What do you mean?" Mrs. Hendricks didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked around the room, her eyes lingering on each student. "I was called in today because your regular teacher knew something was going to happen." The room fell deathly silent as her words sank in. "Mr. Garrett?" one of the girls asked, her voice shaky. "He knew." Mrs. Hendricks nodded slowly. "Yes. But it's not what you think. This isn't just some intruder. This school is haunted by something much older, much darker." The students exchanged nervous glances. A few of them chuckled, assuming she was joking. But there was no humor in Mrs. Hendricks' face. "The entity that's here," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "feeds on fear. It's been trapped in this building for decades. Every lockdown, every drill, gives it an opportunity to find new victims." A few students began to shift uncomfortably, unsure whether to believe her. But the atmosphere in the room had changed. The air felt heavier, colder. "That's ridiculous," Jake scoffed. "You're just trying to scare us." Mrs. Hendricks turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "You'll see for yourself soon enough." Suddenly, the door rattled again, this time more violently. Whoever, or whatever, was outside was now trying to force its way in. The students cowered under their desks, terrified. Without warning, the lights flickered, and the room was plunged into darkness. A few students gasped, and someone stifled a scream. The only light came from the faint glow of their phones, though no one dared to use them. Mrs. Hendricks remained calm, standing in the center of the room as if she expected this. The door began to shake harder, the metal hinges creaking under the strain. "Do not move," Mrs. Hendricks hissed, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "It can sense movement." A low, guttural growl echoed through the hallway, sending chills down the students' spines. It sounded inhuman, like something out of a nightmare. The door continued to rattle, and a few students began to quietly sob, trying to keep their fear contained. Then, everything stopped. The rattling, the growling, it all ceased, leaving the room in an eerie silence. For a moment, no one moved, too terrified to even breathe. Mrs. Hendricks stood still, her eyes closed as if she were listening for something. Then, in the darkness, she smiled, a cold, unsettling smile. "It's chosen," she said softly. "What? What do you mean?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. But before Mrs. Hendricks could answer, the door burst open with a deafening crash. Something dark and shadowy slid into the room, moving with unnatural speed. The students screamed and ducked under their desks, but it was too late. The shadow circled the room like a predator, and one by one, the students began to feel an unbearable cold settling into their bones. Their breaths turned shallow, and a sense of dread filled the air. Jake, closest to the door, was the first to be touched by the darkness. He gasped as it engulfed him, his skin paling, his eyes rolling back into his head. His body froze, locked in place as if his very soul had been drained. The entity moved on, slipping from one student to the next, each one falling silent as it passed. By the time it reached the back of the room, nearly half the class was motionless, their eyes staring blankly ahead. Mrs. Hendricks stood in the center of the room, watching it all unfold with a detached expression. She didn't flinch, didn't move to help. In fact, she almost seemed pleased. When the shadow finally retreated, the remaining students huddled together, trembling. Mrs. Hendricks walked calmly to the door and locked it again. "It will return," she said matter-of-factly, as if this was all part of a lesson. "Next time, it will take more. That's how it survives." The intercom buzzed again, the principal's voice shaky. "Lockdown over. All clear." But nothing was clear. The students who had been touched by the shadow remained catatonic, their eyes blank, their bodies rigid. As Mrs. Hendricks returned to the front of the room, she turned to face the remaining students. "Now you understand. Fear isn't something to be taken lightly." Her eyes flickered with something dark as she sat down at the desk, her hands folded neatly in front of her. And as the survivors slowly rose, they knew one thing for sure: whatever had entered that classroom during the lockdown, it wasn't gone. It was just waiting for the next time the school would fall silent. It was a day like any other at Mason Middle School. The hallways buzzed with the usual chatter of students, lockers clanged shut, and the teachers were preparing for their final classes before the weekend. The loudspeaker crackled. "Attention, students and staff, we are initiating a lockdown. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill." Mrs. Wilson's history class immediately fell silent. The students exchanged nervous glances as Mrs. Wilson moved to lock the door, her face unusually pale. This wasn't the first lockdown they'd experienced, but the tone in the principal's voice was different this time, shaken, almost panicked. "Everyone, under your desks," she instructed. "No talking, and keep your phones off." The students did as they were told, huddling under their desks in the eerily quiet classroom. Mrs. Wilson switched off the lights and crouched behind her desk, her eyes never leaving the door. Minutes passed, but to the students, it felt like hours. There was no sound in the hallway, no indication of what was happening. A few of them dared to whisper, wondering if it was a false alarm. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a faint tapping at the door. The students froze. It wasn't a knock, more like a soft, deliberate tap, like someone was testing the lock. Mrs. Wilson raised her hand to signal silence, her eyes wide with fear. The tapping continued, slowly becoming more insistent. Then, without warning, the doorknob turned, rattling against the lock. The students held their breath. Whoever was on the other side of the door wanted to get in. The tapping stopped, replaced by a scraping sound, as if something sharp was being dragged along the wooden door. Mrs. Wilson's face drained of color. She motioned for the students to stay hidden, her hand shaking as she pulled out her phone. The scraping grew louder, more aggressive. It sounded like nails, long, sharp nails, raking against the door. Then, a whisper, faint but clear, echoed through the room. "Let me in." The students' eyes widened in terror. The voice was low, raspy, and unfamiliar. Mrs. Wilson's fingers hovered over her phone, but she didn't dare make a call. Whoever, or whatever, was outside the door knew they were in there. "Please, let me in." The voice was closer now, almost pleading. The scraping continued, but no one dared to move. Mrs. Wilson's knuckles were white as she gripped the edge of her desk, her breathing shallow. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The students looked at each other, unsure whether to feel relieved or terrified. But Mrs. Wilson didn't move. Her eyes remained fixed on the door, her body tense as if she were bracing for something worse. And then, they heard it, the sound of footsteps, heavy and slow, walking down the hallway. The steps were deliberate, each one echoing ominously through the walls. The principal's voice came over the loudspeaker again, her tone frantic. "Do not open your doors for any reason. Stay hidden. Help is on the way." The footsteps stopped directly outside the door, and for a brief, horrifying moment, everyone thought the handle would turn again. But instead, there was another sound, a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down their spines. The footsteps resumed, fading down the hall until the only sound left was the students' ragged breathing. After what felt like an eternity, the lockdown was lifted, but no one dared to move until the police arrived. When they did, they searched the entire building, but they found nothing. No intruder, no signs of forced entry. The doors were all locked, just as they had been. But Mrs. Wilson and her students knew what they had heard. The voice, the scraping, the growling, it was real, and it wasn't something they would ever forget. The announcement came over the intercom during the last period of the day. "This is a lockdown. Not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill." In room 214, Mr. Jackson's science class immediately shifted into nervous silence. The teacher quickly locked the door, turned off the lights, and instructed everyone to get under their desks. There was a palpable tension in the air. This wasn't the usual practice drill, and everyone knew it. The clock on the wall ticked loudly as the students huddled together, the room now cloaked in darkness. No one said a word, and Mr. Jackson paced back and forth, his face unusually tense. A few minutes passed in heavy silence. Then, the door to the classroom rattled, as though someone was trying to open it. The students froze. Mr. Jackson moved closer to the door, his hand outstretched to signal the students to remain quiet. Whoever was outside began pounding on the door, harder and harder, until the entire classroom seemed to shake. The students looked at each other in terror, their faces pale in the faint light filtering in from the windows. The pounding stopped. There was a long, unsettling silence before a voice, soft, menacing, spoke from the other side. "Let me in." Mr. Jackson backed away from the door, his face drained of color. The voice on the other side of the door was soft, almost a whisper, but it sent chills down everyone's spine. The students stared at Mr. Jackson, their eyes wide with fear. He shook his head at them, silently signaling to stay quiet. "Let me in," the voice repeated, this time more insistent. Mr. Jackson stood frozen, unsure of what to do. His hand trembled as he reached for his phone, but the voice spoke again, chilling the room even further. "I know you're in there." The pounding resumed, harder and more frantic, as if whoever, or whatever, was on the other side was getting desperate. The door rattled violently in its frame, and a few students couldn't hold back quiet sobs. Mr. Jackson stepped toward the door, his face pale, as if he might try to reason with the person outside. But before he could take another step, the pounding suddenly stopped. Complete silence filled the room. The students could barely breathe, waiting for the next horrifying sound. But instead of more pounding, they heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and unnervingly loud in the hallway. They weren't normal footsteps, they were too heavy, like someone was dragging their feet. The steps passed by the door of room 214, and the students thought they might finally be safe. But then, as if taunting them, the footsteps stopped again, right outside the next classroom. The same soft, menacing voice could be heard faintly through the walls. "Let me in." Terror gripped the room as the pounding began again, this time on the neighboring classroom's door. It was as if the intruder was systematically trying each room, seeking a way in. A sense of dread settled over Mr. Jackson's students. They wanted to believe it was over, but something told them it wasn't. Time dragged on, and every second felt like an hour. Then, the footsteps came back, returning to room 214. The soft voice was now right outside their door again. "You can't hide forever." Mr. Jackson's heart pounded in his chest. He knew he had to do something, but what? He motioned for the students to get even lower under their desks, trying to give them a sense of protection. He stood up straighter, positioning himself between them and the door. The silence that followed was unbearable. The voice, the footsteps, the pounding, they had all stopped again. But just as a few of the students dared to hope it was over, the temperature in the room began to drop. It was subtle at first, but soon the air became so cold that the students could see their breath. "What's happening?" one student whispered, unable to hide his panic. Mr. Jackson didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the door. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the ceiling. Everyone looked up, their hearts racing. Above them, the tiles in the drop ceiling started shaking, rattling as if something was crawling through the vents. And then, without warning, one of the tiles crashed down, revealing a dark, gaping hole above the center of the classroom. A cold wind blew through the opening, and the students screamed as something long and black slithered down from the ceiling, a shadowy, shifting form that didn't seem entirely human. Its face was indistinct, a blur of dark features, but its eyes, glowing a dull, eerie red, stared directly at them. The entity dropped to the floor with a thud, moving toward the nearest student. Mr. Jackson reacted instinctively, grabbing a chair and hurling it at the creature. The chair passed right through it, as if the thing wasn't solid at all. "No!" Mr. Jackson shouted, backing up to shield the students. "Stay away!" But the creature didn't stop. It moved closer, gliding across the floor in an unnatural way. The students scrambled to the back of the room, their screams filling the air. Just as the creature reached Mr. Jackson, its shadowy arm outstretched, the intercom crackled back to life. "All clear. The lockdown is over. You may now resume normal activities." The voice was calm, indifferent, as if nothing had happened. But the classroom was anything but normal. The creature, as if reacting to the announcement, stopped in its tracks. For a moment, it hovered in place, its red eyes narrowing. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the entity dissolved into the air, vanishing like smoke. The students sat in stunned silence, too shocked to move. Mr. Jackson fell back against his desk, his chest heaving, unable to process what had just happened. The door to the classroom creaked open, and the hallway was eerily empty. No police, no security, no indication that there had ever been a threat. Everything outside seemed normal. But room 214 would never be the same. The students filed out, too shaken to speak, their eyes darting around as if expecting the creature to reappear. Mr. Jackson was the last to leave. He glanced back at the hole in the ceiling and the shattered tiles on the floor, wondering if anyone would believe what had happened. As he turned to go, the voice echoed softly in his mind, a chilling whisper that he would never forget. "You can't hide forever." Love these stories? YouTube algorithm suggests that you would like to listen to these stories. Click on the video on the screen.